speaker is someone who's really been doing some amazing things with people who have come to her saying that, they have had addictions to all sort of stuff, unhealthy stuff, or they wanted to lose weight, or all sort of things, bad habits. We did a webinar about bad habits. I'm not sure if we actually talked about habits at all, because usually the webinars just went somewhere. And I really wanted to have someone in this conference to really talk about physical health and the mind-body relationship from this perspective that we are exploring here this weekend. So, and then I heard about Elaine, and we had a chat, and during that chat, it was just like so clear to me that she's gonna come here to speak. Like she's the right fit for this conference. To give you a bit of an introduction to Elaine, so Elaine is, so as I said, she works with people, all sort of people really, but especially people who want to get rid of addictions or want to lose weight and that sort of thing. She's written an ebook called Mindfulness, the Non-Diet Diet Book. And there's something funny with the word mindfulness, right? 2 L's. 2 L's. So it actually has nothing to do with mindfulness, the philosophy, mindset thing. So it's from this perspective. And she's written that ebook, and then, I really look forward to hearing what she has to share with us today. So, welcome, Elaine Hillies.
So, I think this says it all really, so I can go. A clever man, he should have been a philosopher, I think, don't you? You have to excuse me, I've never had, I've not got a watch, so I'm trying to put a clock on, and for some reason, there you go, it's gone. So, before I start, Nico just asked me to say a few words about mind, consciousness and thought, about the principles, because he said that a few people have asked, what is this? Because we're all talking about the mind-body connection, as I'm going to be talking about, but he said he just wants a little bit more about the principles, and I'm sure Rudy and Jenny may say a bit more about this, because they're much better at it than me. But the words, don't get too hung up on the words, mind, consciousness and thought, because they're just words to try and explain something that's formless. So, that's difficult, isn't it? So they're just kind of words to explain what we're talking about. And mind is that universal energy. It's for some people it's God, for some people it's spirituality, for some people it's just energy. And consciousness is that wonderful thing that we have that brings our thoughts alive. So mind, consciousness, and thought all kind of work together. And sometimes I explain it to clients. I say, if anyone's got an Xbox, and they plug the Xbox into the wall, and that's mind, that's the energy that's going to power everything. And the Xbox itself is consciousness, because it's not going to work without consciousness. And the game you put in is like your thoughts, because you're going to have an experience of the game you put into the Xbox, just in the same way that you're always going to have an experience of the thoughts you're thinking. The thoughts you're thinking, you'll always have a physical experience of, because we are always in the feeling of our thinking. So I don't know if that kind of makes any sense. And you come and ask any of us in the breaks if you want to know more about it, because we're all happy to chat about it for a very long time. So forget lunch. But so I'm going to be talking about obviously this connection, this mind-body connection, and with physical health, because with all of us there's an exception. Yes, I get the principles and it works with everything, except I've got this thing. And it seems to be different, and with some people it's physical health. Now, what I'm not going to be doing with this is I'm not saying to you that if you have this understanding, hey, you're never going to get sick. Stuff happens. As Sydney Banks, the person that uncovered this, said, life is a contact sport. Stuff happens. People get sick, people have accidents. We can't avoid that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about our reaction to whatever happens. Because people think if you get sick, you can't be peaceful, you can't have a quiet mind. But you can have a quiet mind regardless of the circumstances, when you realise that you are in control of what's going on. You know, we forget sometimes that the body is a self-healing mechanism. The body wants to be healthy. Your cells are programmed to be healthy. But we can achieve this health best when we have a quiet mind, when we let all the stressful thoughts we have, when we allow those to fade away. Because the body needs to return to homeostasis. You know, it needs to return to that place of peace where it can heal, where it needs to do that to be self-healing, where the cells can repair and maybe replace if necessary. So that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about helping yourself to be healthy. And we forget that, as I say, we have this. We forget how powerful we are. So to give you kind of an idea, I'm going to be talking about a few different things. I'd like to start with the placebo effect, and Charlotte knows I've been writing about this. In the 50s, there was a guy called Mr. Wright, and Mr. Wright had something called lymphatic sarcoma, and all the treatments had failed. He was not going to make it, the poor man. They thought he probably had days to live. But Mr. Wright had heard about a drug called crebiozin, and this drug was supposed to be the new miracle drug. And Mr. Wright wanted to live. So he asked his doctors, can I have this drug, can I have this drug? And his doctor said, unfortunately, no, because the clinical trials were only supposed to be for people who had a prognosis of at least 3 months, and Mr. Wright didn't have that time. But then the doctor kind of thought, well, why not? Let's give it to him, you know, let's make his last days a bit happier. And he gave him the drug on the Friday. And he came in on the Monday expecting maybe Mr. Wright wasn't even going to be there. And to his surprise, he was up, walking about, chatting to people. Now, Mr. Wright had tumours the size of oranges in his groin, in his neck, under his arms. He'd had to have his lungs drained twice a day because they were filling up with liquid. And there he was, walking about. And according to the medical records, his tumours had melted like snow on a hot radiator. So they was amazed. My God, this drug does work. This is amazing. So, and not very long after, I think it was something like 10 days, Mr. Wright went home, apparently cancer-free. Had a fantastic time, 2 months he was away. He was talking to people how wonderful this drug was. He was flying his own plane at 12,000 feet. This is someone who had to have his lungs drained. And then there was a big report in the newspapers to say that unfortunately crebiozin wasn't the drug they thought it was, and maybe they'd wasted a lot of money on it. And Mr. Wright read this report, and he believed what he read. Guess what happened? Symptoms came back into hospital. Now, his doctor was clever enough to think, well, okay, we know this drug isn't working very well. Now, something has cured this man. It must be his mind. So the doctor said to Mr. Wright, yeah, the drug got contaminated in transportation, but we have this new super-duper strength one. Would you like to try it? Of course, he said yes. So the doctor injected him with saline water. Same thing happened. A couple of days later, he's up walking about, went home. Had another couple of months, fantastically cancer-free at home. And then the American Medical Association blew it because they wrote a big report on how this drug was never going to work and it was useless. And Mr. Wright read this, believed it, went into a deep depression and went back to hospital. And even though his doctors tried to tell him that it was his mind that had done this, he didn't believe it, he couldn't believe it. So unfortunately he died. Now, you know, you might be thinking, well, yeah, that was in the 50s and they didn't have sophisticated equipment, you know, maybe he didn't really have the cancer they thought, maybe he didn't really get cured, you know. And it's a case study and, you know, an old one. But a few years ago, a guy called David Calms, who works in the Mayo Clinic, you know, this is a clinic in America where all the presidents go to be treated, and he fixes backs. He has this back operation. And he fixes vertebrae. Well, you know how sometimes you hear about people, sadly, they go into hospital and they have the wrong arm cut off. Well, unfortunately, sometimes they put the cement on the wrong vertebrae. And people still get well. So they were like, well, this is very strange. We're going to do a study. So now where Mr. Wright's case was, as I say, a case study, and this was a scientifically placebo-controlled, double-blind test. Couldn't argue with it, and they got 130 people that were going to be on this trial, and all the people that were going to be on this trial knew they were going to be on the trial, so they didn't know if they were going to get the placebo or the operation. They had this back operation. And even the doctors didn't know before they went into the theatre. So what would happen is the person would be anaesthetised, they would have a local anaesthetic, they would be wheeled into the theatre, and a computer would randomised, the computer would flash up whether they were going to get the operation or they were going to get the placebo. And then, if it was the placebo, they would open a bag of medical cement, because apparently it smells like nail varnish remover. And that would add to the feeling that the operation was real. And they would manipulate the spine and they'd say, well, ma'am, we're opening you up and we're just putting the cement in. And they would talk through the operation. And they were finding that as many people got well with the placebo as with had the operation. And there was one woman, a woman called Bonnie Anderson, and she had unfortunately had the operation the year before. She had an accident and cracked a vertebrae. So she had been through the operation. She knew what the operation was like and she knew what the recovery was like. And she'd fallen and cracked her back on the kitchen floor and broken another vertebrae and was in absolute agony. So she was scheduled for this appointment, for this operation. But she got the placebo. Now this is a woman that's going to be hard to fool. She'd had the right one the year before. The day after the operation, she got up. A week later, she was back to playing golf. She was 76 at the time of the operation. This is amazing, isn't it? How does this happen? How do we explain the placebo effect? It works because we believe it. Now, in the case of Mr. Wright, he probably believed the drug was going to cure him. So he gave up on thinking about everything else. Didn't have to worry because the drug was doing it. What did he have to worry about? And then he had the results. The same with Bonnie Anderson and the other people on the trial. They didn't have to think about it. The doctor was going to do it. He was going to fix them. They didn't have to worry about it. And again, they let go of all the thinking that they had about their illness, about what was happening, about the operation, blah, blah, blah. They just let go and they let the doctor take over. And they were cured. And they're keeping track of these people and they're still having no problems. There is a bit of a side effect, unfortunately, because the insurance companies now don't want to pay out for the operation because it costs thousands. And the people can't have the placebo because that's a randomised trial, so there's a bit of a mismatch there. But how does this happen? It's because what the mind believes, the body believes. What we tell our body believes. So it can work the other way too, obviously. I had a client come to me and he was waiting for the results of a biopsy and he was in a really bad way because he was going crazy because he thought he was dying. And what had happened, he'd gone to the doctor and he had a mole on his chest that he didn't like the look of. So he went to the doctor and the doctor said, well, no, actually, I think the mole's fine, but I don't like that lump on your chest. Well, he hadn't even noticed the lump. And the doctor said, innocently, I don't think it's cancerous. Well, you know what happens? As soon as you hear that word, it's like brain freeze. It's like, oh my God, I've got cancer, I've got cancer, I've got cancer. But he said, I want you to go and have a biopsy. So in the time it had taken from the doctor's appointment to the biopsy, and now he was waiting for the results, he'd planned his funeral, he'd written letters to his family and friends. He really thought he was dying. He was having physical symptoms of that. He had pains in his chest, and he thought it had gone to his lungs. He couldn't breathe. He had a headache. He thought that he had brain cancer. His bones ached. He thought it had gone to his bones. He just imagined he was riddled with it, and he had the physical symptoms. Now, isn't that amazing? Don't you think that's amazing that we can do this to ourselves? We have the power to do that, but we forget we have the power to do it the other way too. Now, again, I'm not claiming that we can all heal ourselves of everything. If I had my hand chopped off, I wouldn't be able to grow another one. It doesn't matter how many times, can I grow a hand? It's not going to happen. But my experience of not having that hand will be down to me. And the way my body reacts to not having a hand will be down to me. So if I went into completely stressful thoughts and thought, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to use a knife and a fork at the same time, or, you know, I don't know, scratch my leg and my head at the same, I don't know, whatever I would be thinking, that would be down to me. That would be my creation. Yeah? And it's crazy how much we do this. It's a bit like children, whoever has children here, you know, children, if they hurt themselves, they physically hurt themselves. Often they don't even notice, do they? It's us as the adult that points it out, or if they see it. You know, when my daughters were very young, you know how when they get that tooth that's really wobbly, I hate doing this with it when their teeth are coming out, and you just know it's going to hurt. And I kept saying, let me pull it out, let me pull it out. And in the end, my daughter said, oh, yeah. But unfortunately, I pulled the tooth next to it out. There wasn't at all ready. I don't know why they had Childline on speed dial, but and she thought it was the tooth that came out. So, you know, she went running to the mirror, saw it was the wrong one, and just howled. You know, suddenly it really hurt. But because that's what happens, isn't it? We feel the effect of what we're thinking, and this happens all the time. You know. Look at the other wonderful placebo. There's a fantastic placebo, a common placebo that happens to lots of people at once, and that's Lourdes. Now, you know, you've heard of Lourdes, the healing waters of Lourdes, and people go for a pilgrimage there, and then they're going with the intention often of being cured of something. They go in, there's a mass kind of feeling about it, that this is going to be great. And there are many cases of spontaneous healing that happen that can't be explained. I mean, the church, the Catholic Church, you know, they want to put a lid on this. They don't want it to be spontaneous healing. They want it to be a divine intervention. It's got to be the hand of God. I mean, so much so that they have a whole list of criteria that you have to meet if you've been healed. It doesn't matter, actually, if you look healed, you feel healed, you've got to meet this criteria. Because, you know, if it's a hand of God. So much so, they have a physician on hand at Lourdes that if somebody does feel that they've been healed of something, they have to go through this checklist. Because the church acknowledge that people can be healed through the power of their mind. But they want it to be, you know, the hand of God. Unfortunately, since the 1800s, I think only 68 people have ever met their criteria. So they're not going to make anybody a saint just yet. But, you know, what happens there? What happens there? Now, you know, again, people may say, oh, it's adrenaline that can cause, you know, you to feel something has changed, has shifted. It can be the power of thought at that time, but you have to hold on to it. And if you don't hold on to it, then that feeling is going to go. And then, you know, you're going to have that pain in your right toe again. I don't know. There have been lots of people that have been cases that, you know, 10, 15, 20, 50 years later, they're still feeling good. You know? My mum there was a family friend, a good friend of my mum's, and he was blind, severely overweight and blind. And he and his wife used to go to church every week. They loved it, had a very strong faith, and the church suggested a trip to Lourdes, pilgrimage to Lourdes. So he was like, yeah, I'm up for that. And off they went in a coach, and took them ages, and got there and everybody's tired. And because of his weight, they have lots of volunteers at Lourdes, and they said, oh, you're not going to be able to get through the crowds, huge amount of people, you're not going to be able to get through and get down to the grotto where the water is. We'll put you in a wheelchair. So they put him in a wheelchair, and off they went, and they got to the water. And of course, when they got to the water, he stood up. And everyone said, yay, it's a miracle. He said, no, I'm still blind. You know? It's not going to happen for everyone, it's not Disney. But the wonderful thing about this guy was he hadn't been blind from birth. He got blind in his teens. But, you know, he didn't kind of mind. He didn't mind about it. He accepted, that's what, you know, he was very religious. He had this attitude of let go, let God. He wasn't in a ton of thinking about his predicament. His situation. He didn't think, oh, it's not fair, and why did that happen, and why me? And he just accepted it. And, you know, despite his weight, because he was a very, very large man, and despite his weight, he lived for a very, very long time. I think he was in his 90s when he died, because he was happy. He was happy in himself. He didn't feel a need to be cured, but he wasn't in the feeling of his of his blindness or his weight even. He was in a good feeling most of the time, and you could say that was faith. I don't know. You could say it was a whiskey. I don't know. But he was happy, you know, and we know when you're happy, you add years to your life. Now again, this isn't saying that you have to be happy. There's nothing worse than having to be happy, is there? Because that's real effort, you know, and there's nothing worse than if you're feeling really angry and you're going, oh, I'm happy, I'm not angry. It's so much better to just accept the feeling you're in. I'm in a bad feeling. Okay, so what? Yeah. You know, you don't have to be a certain way. There's nothing wrong with feeling upset. There's nothing wrong with feeling angry, cross, whatever you're in. It's just, as Anders was saying, knowing, having the feeling, you know, how the kind of quality of your thoughts. You don't need to know what your thoughts are, but you need to know the quality of your thoughts. I mean, I don't know, you may have heard this often, but Stanford University, they say we have 60,000 thoughts a year. And the Laboratory of Neuroimaging say we have 70,000 thoughts a year. This is all done with fMRIs. They can see how many times the area lights up. Obviously, they can't see the content. Why do they need to know that? And some people say we have 100,000 thoughts a day. And I mean, that's a lot of thinking, isn't it? It's much harder to hold on to a thought, whether it's angry, whatever it would be. You know, we are designed to let those thoughts run through us. We can't possibly hold on to that many thoughts. We're designed to just have them, let them go, have them, let them go, have them, let them go. I often say to clients, it's a bit like a snowflake landing. Your thought is like a snowflake. It lands, it melts, it lands, it melts. But what happens if you have a flurry of snow? There's no time for it to go, and you end up with a big snowball. And that's the kind of what we do with our thinking. Instead of allowing the thought to go, we add and add and add and layer until we're in the feeling. We're in the physical feeling of our thinking. And I say, you know, we don't know when that mood changes. It's a bit like the moment, we don't know when we fall asleep. We don't know when we wake up, even if we have an alarm or a knocker-upper. We don't know when that happens. We just know we were asleep and we know we are awake. And that's what happens with moods. That's what happens with your moods when you don't hold on to it. You suddenly think, oh, you know, I was feeling really quite cross earlier, but I'm not now. I don't know why. Because they just change. They just change. So, you know, we know the church acknowledges that we can heal through the power of our mind. But, you know, how does that happen? How does that happen? And, you know, some people say, I have had clients that come to me and they say, well, yeah, it's all right for them. I'm a nervous person. I'm a worrier. That's just who I am. No, sorry, I'm not having that. Because through the study of epigenetics, we know so much more now about our genes and everything. And they used to think we had like 120,000 genes, a gene for each protein in our body. And now scientists have discovered we have about 25 genes. Okay, not many at all, really. But what they've also discovered is each one of those genes can express itself 30,000 different ways. I mean, how amazing is that? We are not fixed entities. We are not even the way we were a second ago. We can change. We can change. We can express our genes differently. Dr. Bruce Lipton, who is a cellular biologist, he talks about this a lot, and he says that you can't change your DNA, but you can change the way your DNA is expressed. And he has a study where he took one pluripotential cell, stem cell. Now this is a cell that can be anything that it wants to when it grows up. It might want to be a bus driver, might want to be a ballerina, I don't know. But this cell can be anything. And he nourished this cell with a cell culture medium, and this cell divided and divided and divided. And when he had enough, he divided this one that's one cell, so all the cells are genetically the same. And he divided these into 3 dishes. And he carried on culturing them. Now he put these these dishes in different environments, and the environments they were in determined how they were expressed. The environment they were in determined whether they became a fat cell, a muscle cell, or a bone cell. Now what determined the fate of that cell? It wasn't genetics, because they were all genetically exactly the same. And when we talk about environment and the way the environment is expressing, We are talking about the physical environment where we live, whether you like where you live, because, you know, one person may say, well, yeah, I wouldn't want to live in the city, and another person may say, I love the city, I couldn't live in the country. So it's not that there's the right place to live, it's the way you feel about the place you live, about the environment. But it's also, obviously, nutrition, the food you eat, the food you put into your body, that's going to have an influence on how your cell is expressed. But most importantly, it's the thoughts and emotions that you have that determine how your cells are expressed. Now, that's absolutely fascinating to me, that science is actually confirming what we know, that we are always feeling our thinking, and our body will have a physical reaction to our thoughts. Now, that is amazing, isn't it? I mean, how powerful are we? You know, we used to say, oh, you're just like, you know, you're going to be just like your mum, you're just like your dad, you're just like... You know, when I was diagnosed with cancer 7 years ago at the same age that my mum had been diagnosed with cancer. But sadly, my mum died 5 years later. Well, I'm not my mum. I'm not my mum. I don't have to do that. I don't have to die because she did. You know, eventually I'm going to, obviously, but not just because she did. And that's, you know, that I think is our power. But it's not just our power, it's the power of understanding the principles. It's the power of understanding that we are not hopeless, helpless victims of anything. We can't control our circumstances. You know, I didn't want to get cancer. Who knows if it's going to come back? I don't want to get it again, it was really boring. But if it did, I'd have to deal with it in the same way, wouldn't I? I'd just get on with it. I mean, interestingly, when I did get it, I worked in a university part-time, used to see clients in the evening. And the staff at the university asked me if I would break my diagnosis to my colleagues a bit more gently because they couldn't cope. Yeah, I was fine. But, you know, we are not our genes, we are not predetermined. We can be who we want to be moment by moment. And as Morten was saying yesterday, we can be that now and now. And now, you know, and as I say, I think that's amazing, that the capacity that our mind has to heal us when we allow it to, when we just let go, okay? And as I say, it doesn't mean to say you have to be happy, but although we know happiness has a factor. There was a guy who was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer in 1976, a guy called Stamatis Moretis, and there are lots of videos of him on YouTube and whatever. And he was living in America. He was a Greek war veteran, and he was living in America, and he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he asked many doctors, and they all said if he had the treatment, it would give him a few months maybe, but it wasn't going to cure him. And he thought, well, you know, if I die in America, it's going to cost me, the funeral is going to cost like $1,000. Well, if I go back home to my native island, he lived in an island called Ikaria, and he thought if I go back there, the funeral is going to cost like a couple of $100, much more left in the pension pot for my wife. So they went back and they moved in with his aged parents who lived on an untended vineyard. And he went to bed. He'd been given 6 to 9 months to live. So he went to bed, because after all, you know, he was dying, so he just go to bed. And then his friends got word that he was back on the island, and they started turning up with bottles of wine and backgammon, and they started entertaining him. And then time went on, and he was a bit bored in bed, so he got up and he started pottering about and planting some vegetables, and 6 months went past and he hadn't died. So he started to work in the vineyard, and time went on, and he was enjoying the sun and his wine, enjoying his friends and his wife. And then he built an extension on the house so his grown-up children could come and visit from America. And then 25 years later, he decided to go back to America and say to the doctors, what's going on? But unfortunately, all the doctors died. And he died in 2013, aged 102. You know. Now this guy, you know, what happened? Now, this guy had a good faith again, you know, and I'm not talking about, you know, you have a religion or you don't. That's up to you. That's entirely up to you. But it was still that letting go. He didn't kind of stress about it. He wasn't doing things. He was just being and enjoying himself. And he died, you know. I mean, it can work the other way too. There was a report by a doctor called Henry Siegel, and he reported about a priest that was called in to read the last rites to somebody in this very large Roman Catholic church in America. And the priest came in and very austere and authoritatively and in a brusque voice read the last rites to the wrong patient. And he died 15 minutes later, and the other one lasted a few days. I mean, you know, who can say? But the power of belief is so strong, and it's again not something you have to practice. Like Anders was saying, you don't have to say, you know, I am confident, I am strong. You just have to allow things to be. You just have to allow yourself. If you feel sad, be sad. You know, I mean, when I got my diagnosis, I'm not going to say I didn't have my 3 o'clock in the morning, oh shit moments. But you know, what happens most of the time when people get a diagnosis of something, and I have lots of people come to me that have been diagnosed with various things, people are rarely worrying about this second. What they're frightened of when they get a diagnosis is what's going to happen. They're not even necessarily worried about the operation or the treatment. They're worried about their diagnosis, their prognosis. They think what is going to happen, and then they project themselves into this very miserable future where they think they're just going to get ill and sick. Well, you know, we don't have to do that. We don't have to do that. You can, however ill anybody is, you can have a peaceful mind. You can be peaceful in yourself. You can allow your mind to quieten if you let it. If you let go of the stressful thinking that you have. You can have that thinking, but you know you're having that thinking again by the feeling, and then you can let it go. You know, it's quite remarkable what we do to ourselves. You know, I say to my clients sometimes, look how clever you are, that you've created this. You know, I often have clients come to me because they're having physical pain. They're having physical pain. Lots of times they've been to the hospital, they've had all the tests. I had somebody the night before I came away who had terrible flashing lights, and she felt as if half her mind was going, half her brain was going black. I said, how do you feel black? But she couldn't tell me. But she felt that it was going black. And she was so scared that she had some kind of brain tumour. But she'd had all of the tests. Now, even as we were talking, we kind of sat and chatted for about an hour and a half about this. It went. And she'd had this for months. So, you know, I'm a bit kind of last chance saloon. So when people have had this, and once they know it's not a medical problem, and they come to me, because they're holding on, you know, and we put ourselves through all kinds of pain without realising we're doing it. I had an author that comes to me sometimes, and she has a whole range of books with the same characters, and these characters are very familiar to her. The books are very successful, and she came to me because she had this. She thought there was going to be a family confrontation, and she doesn't like confrontation, and she was worrying about it. And you know what it's like when we have an argument in our head? Well, I hope this isn't just me. I do my bit, I do their bit, I do my bit, I do their bit. And then I've had this whole argument, and then I wonder why I feel bad. And that's what she was doing. She was having this whole argument in her head and wondering why she was feeling bad. She couldn't sleep, she was feeling stressed, she wasn't able to work. And I said to her, all right, okay. I said, oh, by the way, how do you plot your books? And she said, that's really easy. She said, I see the characters, and they're doing whatever they're doing, and then I write it up. And I said, oh, okay. How do you know it isn't real? She was like, because I've made it up. I said, oh, really? And then because we'd had quite a few sessions before, she suddenly could see what she hadn't been able to see. Because on this hand, she had these characters doing whatever they were doing, and they may have been in some scary situations in her book, but she wasn't feeling anything about that. It wasn't scaring her. You know, she did say sometimes if she had a particularly sad scene, she cried, but apart from that, she wasn't having really any emotion. But on this hand, she had a whole scenario where she was making up things exactly the same way because it wasn't happening right now. She wasn't having an argument with somebody right now. She was entirely making it up. But that felt really real to her. And because that felt so real, she was suffering for it. She was physically suffering the thing she was making up. Now, isn't that strange? Isn't that funny how we don't do that? We all fall into this every day. I do it myself. You know, I think, I feel something that I'm thinking. You know, if you all think that what I'm talking about is rubbish, well, I'm sorry, that's from you. It has nothing to do with me. But you know, we feel pain, and that's so strange, I think, that we can feel physical pain. And when I talk about this to my clients, they say, but you know, how can I feel my emotion? How can I feel my emotion? Sometimes it doesn't seem to make sense to them. And in 2003, there was a test by UCLA, and they were looking at the pain of rejection and you know, social exclusion, that kind of thing. So they had a test where they had participants who were playing a game on a computer, a game of catching the ball, throwing and catching the ball. And one character represented the participant, but they were playing a game with two other participants in other rooms, and they were all playing this game of catch. But actually, it wasn't two other participants at all, it was a computer-led program. So for the first half of the game, the participant would be throwing the ball and catching it, and everybody would be throwing it to each other quite fairly. And in the second half, the participant didn't get the ball at all. They didn't throw it to her at all. And the participant was feeling more and more left out and excluded and bad, and the mood was dropping all the time. But what they could tell, because the participants were wired up, what they could tell is there was a lot of activity in a part of the brain called the angular cingulate cortex, the ACC. Now the ACC is where we process physical pain. But the area that processes physical pain was lighting up with the emotional pain this person was feeling. And science can now prove that we physically and scientifically feel our emotional pain. So it's not just in your head. It's not just we are making it up and we are feeling the effects, but it isn't just an airy-fairy. You know, there are always going to be some people who think, yeah, well, okay, right, yeah, I'm feeling my thinking, yeah. But, you know, now we have scientific proof. There was another study in 2011 that confirmed it, that was conducted by the National Institute of Mental Health, and they confirmed that there's a neural overlap in the area of the brain, in the ACC, that processes physical pain and also processes emotional pain. So that's amazing, isn't it? Oh, I don't know, is it just me that finds it amazing? I think it's amazing. That you know, science has caught up with this. So we can think, as I say, we can think, obviously, that's why we're here, but we can think that well, some people can do this and some people can't. And you know, I'm giving to you that we can all do this. As I say, we can't, I'm not saying we can heal ourselves. Clearly there have been people that have. I'm saying we have the capacity, we have the potential to aid healing in our body, to aid our body to heal itself, to recognize that we have that power, because we are always feeling our thinking, and physical pain can be an inside-out job. You know, when you know, I'm sharing my story here. I hope you don't mind. But you know, when I had cancer and I used to have radiotherapy, I had a very busy life. I was moving house, and you know, it was busy. It was busy, and I'd go for radiotherapy. You know, and they get you in the position, and you have the tattoo, so they can make sure you're in the right place and everything, and they have to move you around a bit, and sometimes they have to be a little bit physical to get you in exactly the right place. And they would apologise. They would say, "Oh, I'm really sorry about this," and I hope you... And I'd say, well, actually, it's a good chance for a lie down. And they said to me, I don't think everybody feels like that. And they would tell me about people that would be rigid. They could not get them in the right position for the radiotherapy because they would be so rigid. Now, they had to be completely in their head at that time because the bodies are the same. So they were probably so worried and so in their head about even that moment that they could not relax. They could not relax into something that, is what it is, isn't it? So, as I say, I'm kind of passing this on to you, that we have this amazing capacity. And it isn't just, I know in the blurb, Nico said to me, what do you want to talk about? And I said, well, I'll talk about anything really. It's always going to be the same thing. It's always going to be feeling our thinking. It's always going to be that we are creating our reality. As I say, what I find fascinating is that we know we are creating our reality around us. We know that our experience of everything is going to be our experience through our thinking. But I think it's amazing now that we know that we can change our biology, we can change our cell structure with our thinking. So anyway, I said to him, I don't know, you choose. So he came up with physical health, and I thought, that's good, I like that, And then he said, what do you want to talk about with physical health? And I kind of did these things. And then when I looked at it yesterday, I looked online and I thought, Jesus, I've thrown everything here. I've given the kitchen sink as well. Because I also saw that I was talking about mental health. And it's still the same thing. It's not still the same thing. I'm not dismissing that people have terrible problems. But I am going to put to you that often people become their labels. So people get a label of mental illness given to them, and they believe their label. And then when they believe their label, they start to become whatever it is they've been labelled. Now, there was a study in the 70s again, I think it was, a guy called David Rosenhan, and he got himself and 7 friends. None of them had ever had a diagnosis of mental illness, but he wanted to test this, and he went out with his 7 friends. They all went out, and they all had to approach a mental institution and say they heard voices in their head. The only things they could say, the only things they could say the voices said were empty, thud, and hollow. That was it. That was the only lie they could tell, apart from the fact they gave false names and addresses because of insurance and work problems or whatever. So they went out to different institutions to try this, and I think they went to 12 institutions eventually. And they went to 5 different states in America, on the east and west coast. And some of the institutions were quite old and shabby. Some of them were very new. Some of them had private funding. Some of them were state funded. They were understaffed. Some had a very good patient to staff ratio. So they were a mixed bag. And he said to his wife, I'll only be a couple of days, don't worry, I'll be back in a couple of days. 2 months it took him to get out. Because every single one of these 8 people was given a diagnosis of being insane. Every single one of them. 7 of them were considered to be schizophrenic, and 1 was manic depressive. Now, none of these people had ever had any psychiatric problems. And they could tell the staff they're fine. Well, of course, the staff thought, they're in denial. They think they're fine. Up the medicine. They were given like 2,000, between them, 2,000 antipsychotic drugs. Only 2, fortunately, were swallowed, and the rest were either pocketed or flushed away. Interestingly, when they flushed them away, they also found other people's tablets there, so other of the patients were flushing them too. They couldn't say, they were sane. They weren't able to get out saying they were sane. What they had to do was say they were insane and then pretend to get better. And that was the only way they got out. Now, again, you could say, this is the 70s. And, when the report came out, people were very upset about this because they said, you're tricking the psychiatrist. You're not playing the game. That's not fair. These poor psychiatrists, they've got this checklist, haven't they? They've got a checklist to go against, this DSM. Well, I think it's something like, when the DSM, when the first one came out, it was something like 89 pages, I can't quite remember. And I know by the third DSM, by the third version, there was a guy called Robert Spritzer who became the editor. And there's many reports about this, I'm really not making it up. But he got 25 committees, and all these people would meet at various times. Psychiatrists, psychologists would meet in a room in, I think it was Columbia University. And they would shout out a medical, they thought that was a medical term. They would shout out something they thought would be wrong with people. And they would give a list of symptoms for this thing. And then all of the other psychiatrists, psychologists would shout out whether they agreed or not. And if they agreed, and if Robert Spritzer agreed, and by all accounts apparently he agreed with most things, Robert Spritzer would type it up on an old typewriter and it would go into the DSM. Now, I think they took 6 years doing this, and when the DSM was about to be released in 1980, they decided to road test it. They had to road test it first. So they sent out a questionnaire and a whole team of researchers to go out and test these syndromes and terms on the public. Turns out over 50% of the public were mad because they all had these symptoms. But most interestingly, when the DSM-3 came out, it was a bestseller. It sold over 1 million copies. Now that's many more psychiatrists, there's many more than psychiatrists or psychologists around, because the average person was going out and buying this and diagnosing themselves and diagnosing everybody else as well. I do that with the psycho test, do it in my other half, you're definitely a psycho, look, you meet that criteria in that one. But people were going out and they were diagnosing each other. And I can't remember how many pages that came in at, but I think we're on DSM-5 now, and DSM-5 is, I think, over 900 pages. We're clearly getting a lot sicker, aren't we? Now, just a few years ago, I think it was in 2008, the BBC decided to kind of do another version of the Rosenhan test. But what they did is they got 10 people. And they got these 10 people, 5 had a diagnosis, a mental illness diagnosis, and 5 had no diagnosis at all. And they put them in a place in England called Hever Castle. They put them in there. And they had a team of 3 people, psychiatrists, psychologists, the very people that diagnose give somebody a label when they come to see them. They had it over 3 days. They had various things. They had, I think they had to go and clear out a cow shed or something, and one of the guys had OCD, they were trying to see who had what. They got it wrong again and again and again. They diagnosed people that never had a medical diagnosis, that never had anything wrong. They misdiagnosed the people that did have a diagnosis. They were stunned at the end. They were forced to admit that actually they really couldn't go with the checklist they had, and even with what they were seeing, because what they were seeing didn't always correlate with the diagnosis that somebody had. Do not believe your label. If you have a label of anything, do not believe it. You can express yourself differently, okay? I had one guy that I used to work with, and he had a diagnosis of schizophrenia when he was 17. And he was 65 when I saw him. And he said, I've had more bouts of flu over the years than I've ever had schizophrenia. But no one ever calls me a persistent flu sufferer, So I really would just like to put it to people that you are able, as I say, to be whatever you want. And as I say, I think it's amazing that we can change. Change, as Chantal was saying, change happens. Change happens throughout the universe all the time. Almost every 7 years, you completely replaced everything in your body cell-wise, and every 7 years you're like a new person. Why would you hold on to the old thinking that you had? But even why would you hold on to the old thinking that you had yesterday? I mean, Jamie and Chantal have known me a long time, and there is no way I could have stood up in front of people. I was terrified of talking to a very small group. And I was saying to Dickon, I think it was yesterday, that years ago when I worked in an office, and I would work with people very happily and laughing, joking, enjoying their company, and then maybe they would go into a meeting and the phone might ring and the phone might be for one of them. I couldn't go into the meeting and tell them that they had a phone call. All the people I knew, all the people I'd been laughing and joking with 5 minutes before, because I couldn't go in to that. Well, they're going to look at me. I don't want to go in there, they're going to look at me. You know, there is no way I could have done this years ago. But I'm not who I was years ago, because I've changed. I've changed, my thinking changes. My thinking changes every minute. My cells express themselves differently. I don't know, I actually can't say if it's daily, weekly, monthly, but isn't it nice that I know not only mentally can I can change physically. My cells can be whatever I am believing. You do not need to believe the labels you give yourself, or the diagnosis someone else has given you, or the label someone else has given you, because you can allow yourself to trust yourself. And you can be like Stomatis and just enjoy a few glasses of wine too. That goes for me. So that's it. As everybody said, that's it. That's all I've got. But I hope it's given you something to think about at least. You know, the understanding these principles, understanding the power of mind, consciousness and thought, and how innocently and crazily we use it against ourselves. Instead of using this fantastic power that we've been given, we use it against ourselves. You know, we are our own God, whether you're religious or not. Now that's why this is called a temple. We have what we need. We have everything we need. And there is no illness in the body apart from the mind. That's it. Thank you.